Hi everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Rania Awaad, who's an assistant professor at Stanford University, here to give us a talk about Islamophobia and clinical considerations from a Muslim psychiatrist. I'd say this is pretty timely right now in our country. So I'll tell you a little bit about Dr. Awaad. She actually has dual degrees from the University of Michigan, both in biological anthropology in Arabic and Islamic studies. Then she actually pursued classical Islamic studies work in Syria and holds a certificate in Quran, Islamic law, and other branches of the Islamic sciences. She got her MD from Wright State University and then did her psychiatry training at Stanford, and also did an NIMH T32 training grant where she focused on mental health needs of Muslim populations. She's the medical director of the Bay Area branch of the Khalili Center. So for those of you who haven't seen this before, I would look this up. This is a great spiritual wellness center pioneering the application of traditional Islamic spiritual healing methods to modern clinical psychology. She also received a Stanford Outstanding Community Partnership Award this year, and so for her outstanding work in this area. She's the director of the Muslim and Mental Health Lab, and for those of you also who didn't see it, she just had a really great recent article in the Green Journal, which is the American Journal of Psychiatry, on a Muslim graduate student from Sudan trapped by the travel ban. So where she really goes into kind of a clinical case of a patient and then describes kind of the some clinical considerations that you might consider when you're working with a patient who might be impacted by the ban. She's had a lot of additional work, but I've just been so impressed by her moving the needle forward in this area, especially again right now where there's been, as most of you know, kind of a travel ban and an uptick in Islamophobia in our country, and I think it's particularly relevant when we're treating these vulnerable patients. So I'm very appreciative of her being here today, so please help me to welcome Dr. Awaad.
Good morning. How is everyone doing on this Tuesday morning? Doing okay? Ready for some turkey soon? All right. Well, it is definitely my pleasure to be here today, and definitely an honor. Thank you, Dr. Christina, for the invitation. And I'm hoping to share with all of you today a little bit about my work, and as Dr. Christina mentioned, this timely conversation that has been affecting definitely the Muslim community for some time, but I definitely wanted to speak at it from a clinical perspective. And so I'll share with you a little bit first about some of the work I've been doing. This is just a screenshot of the website that you can visit, the Stanford Muslims and Mental Health Lab, which was put together a few years ago now, but has several lines of research that focus specifically on the mental health needs of the Muslim population from all different perspectives. This is here's a little bit of our kind of breakdown, the different 8 or 9 different lines of research that run through it. You'll see that one of them specifically focuses on social justice issues where the topic of Islamophobia fits in, but certainly there's many other parts of this lab and the different research we do as well. And so I'll share a little bit about this as we go forward, but I wanted to let you know of this resource that you can visit at any point. Dr. Christina mentioned the article that's in the Green Journal, and to start us off today, I've actually taken kind of captured that clinical vignette that I'll share with you, which of course you're welcome to read, but I'll also talk you through it a little bit, because I think that this is really a case in point for our discussion today. This is actually one of our own Stanford students, and she has gone public, so although in the Green Journal, any medical literature we write anonymously, but she herself has come forward, and her interviews are available online for when this happened to her and kind of her reaction to it. But it's a really touching case, I would say. This is a Stanford student who is in anthropology. She was doing field work in the Sudan. She herself is Sudanese, and had been out in the fields to do her work, and then the field workers essentially stopped her one day and said, your president is doing something strange over there. Maybe you should figure out what's going on. So she leaves the fields and like runs over to where the nearest TV is and turns on the news to find, announcements that Trump is going to, roll out this travel ban, and Sudan is one of the named countries. This is the first iteration of the travel ban. And there she is in the middle of her work and phones Stanford, who wires her some money to get her on the first plane out of there, as they advised her to do. However, she misses a connecting flight and ends at JFK Airport in New York 20 minutes after the travel ban has gone into effect. So to give you a little more background on who this person is and what her story is, she comes to the U.S. as a teenager. I believe she was about 14, on a scholarship to attend high school because of her academic success. From there, she's accepted to Harvard, where she does her undergrad degree. And then she goes into the nonprofit world and works with underprivileged youth for a while before she applies for a PhD at Stanford, which brings us up to the current date. In her words, when she got to JFK Airport 20 minutes after the ban is signed, she found herself handcuffed and then very invasively checked. And for a person who had a prior history of PTSD, this was re-triggering all of that trauma over again. And what was really difficult, she said, I am the person who would be considered the success story. I am the one who came here and pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, who was really able to make the best of this country's resources and give back the best I could. Yet here I am, a permanent resident of this country, and I am handcuffed, and I am invasively searched, and I'm not allowed out with any legal representation. You may remember early on they did not allow any legal representation for those who were detained, because those who are in customs are not technically on U.S. soil. A lot of people don't quite realize that. You have no rights in that ambiguous gray zone. And so there she was. She said, all the grit that I have in my life and all the perseverance I've had, I just broke down and started crying. And I was there detained along with nationals from Iran and Iraq and Syria and Sudan and the like. And just looking at everybody else, we're all looking at each other completely amazed, because here she is, she actually holds a green card, right? And the first iteration of the ban, as you might remember, included also green card holders. And was wondering, what possibly could I have done to deserve this, right? So when all the trauma kind of reflares for her, it causes, and she had worked really hard, by the way, to deal with the original PTSD symptoms. And remember, so many of the countries that are listed are countries in which are war-torn to begin with. There had always been trauma in those countries. So their citizens, their nationals, have also come with trauma anyway. And then when you come into a new country, there is additional trauma of trying to acculturate and figure out the ropes. But she had done all of that so well. And yet here she was, handcuffed at JFK and unsure what to do next. And when she asks, and finally after hours and hours, the lawyers that were sent over from Stanford were finally able to communicate with her and actually, on her behalf, get her out of that place. But she asked Customs at that point and said, do I have any possibility of going back to the Sudan? And they said, we advise against it. So in that moment, she realized even her PhD work, her doctoral work that relies on her going back, was shot. And the fact that she still had family there was also this limbo. Either you choose your PhD, right, doctoral work, or you choose your family, or in one moment she felt like she lost all of it, right? And then there's a discussion too that she mentions about her significant other, who has what she called tenuous immigration status. So she was further along than he. And that caused quite a bit of strain because it meant that they couldn't see each other either. And there was also an elderly father that she had already put in papers to try to bring him here for care, and that too meant that that person, that her family members couldn't come either. And she couldn't go back. So this very kind of limbo state illustrates, I think, the reality of so many. And until this very day, there are students I'm working with at Stanford who say, I haven't been back, and I know that I can't go back until this administration is over. And tears, real kind of anguish of everybody else gets to see their families. And remember, undergraduate student, this is a graduate student, but undergraduate students are what, 18, 19, 20 at best, right? And the anguish of not being able to see their families is really difficult, right? So with that, I just wanted to illustrate that case to really kind of segue into this discussion of what exactly is Islamophobia and how could such a thing hit our country? Why is it that we have people who are so, why is it that there's a ban that is keeping out the brightest minds when it should be keeping out those who we really don't want here, perhaps? So Islamophobia, as you know, is defined as anti-Islamic rhetoric and sentiment, and there was definitely an uptick after 9/11. What's interesting now, when you look at the research coming out of the Pew Research Center and the like, you're seeing that now the Islamophobia that had originally been with a certain group of people now is sort of like widespread between different ages and groups and backgrounds. And I think that's probably the most alarming piece of this all. The most current stats, if we look at how this kind of goes here, in terms of hate crimes, before 9/11, the FBI counted 28 cases. The year of 9/11, which was later in the year, right, 481, right? So an incredible uptick of cases of hate crimes. And by the way, not every case of Islamophobia or hate crime is reported through the FBI. This is just what the FBI was able to collect. Here, when we see, then we kind of fast forward from 2001 to the last couple of years where the election cycle was happening, and you see a 70% increase in Islamophobia per the FBI. And they just actually released within a couple of days ago the newest stats for 2016 and said it rose again, another 28%. So it's just sort of going up and up and up, and we don't really, as a Muslim community, we don't really see this ending anytime soon. So definitely a conversation that needs to be had. When you look at the post-election, kind of what I call the aftermath of Trump's election, because you had the election and not very long after you had the travel ban happen. So it was like one thing after another for the community. And this is where hard numbers, really, we start to figure out what's going on. It's interesting that you find, thankfully, over half of the population is saying something like, a little over half, saying, not much support for extremism among Muslim Americans, or maybe there's none at all. But there's also, the percentages there, the 24 and the 11, who believe absolutely there is. And that's cause for alarm for the average Muslim American who feels like, where is this exactly coming from, right? I have to say, though, that in all the studies that have come out, and Pew Study has put out some good data out there saying that people who know a Muslim directly are less likely to actually feel this way. And although the percentages aren't much higher necessarily, it's something like, the difference between 55% to 60%, but I'll take the 5%. Do you know what I mean? I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, especially as you're working with those in the community that are affected by Islamophobia. And so if we really want to talk about terrorism, I think, and we have to kind of spend some time here talking about it. Again, this is FBI data straight from their resources. If you look at the first pie chart there, you're seeing that there's 1980 to 2005. And people are often really amazed because they're not really expecting these numbers when they think of terrorism or extremism. Usually they think of Islamic extremism being kind of very high on that list because that's what the media is constantly putting out. But the percentages there, of 6%, and even when you add on roughly 10 more years, which is the more recent data that's now published, it's gone down even further to about 4%. So you look at the different groups of extremism, these are actually, by the way, these are actual acts of terrorism, right? So it really puts things in perspective as where does terrorism, where does Islamic terrorism, as it's called, really stand? And this is by, again, FBI data straight from their own resources. So what is it, so why is it that we don't hear about any of the other groups so much in the media, but we're constantly fed a specific message. I think that's the real question today, especially as we're talking about how to work with, again, Muslims who are affected by Islamophobia, because when they see these numbers, it's kind of mind-boggling. Why are they pretty much the scapegoat a lot of the times? Not always, but a lot of the time. This comment here that, American Muslims might be a little more scared of other Americans, let's say, than they have, that Americans should be of other Americans should be of them. It's really this idea, and by the way, this poll that's taken from US Today, that's in 2006. Mind you, this is 10 years before Trump is saying Muslim registry. There are 40% almost of our population or of this survey study are saying let's have Muslims carry ID cards. So it's not far-fetched to then see where the Muslim registry comes from, right? This idea. And then as you go on today, you really see that there is definitely a target, and we see this a lot, right? We kind of see signs on mosques and mosques being burned and people being targeted and the like. And people who are not even Muslim. The Sikh population, unfortunately, has taken the brunt of this as well because they wear turbans. The men may wear turbans, may be interpreted as Muslims when they're not even. So almost like guilty by association. And it's really problematic. And I certainly couldn't have a conversation about this topic without speaking about, here, one of your own, right? So on the left here you see Suzanne Barakat, who is the sister of Dia Barakat. These are the Chapel Hill shooting murder victims, and Hicks, who is the murderer. But Suzanne is one of your own. She's a UCSF family medicine resident and has been incredibly eloquent in really speaking about this, the impact of Islamophobia directly on her own family. These were 3 college students. One was in dental school and the other was college. It was Dia and his wife and her sister, and were just shot execution style in their own apartment by this neighbor of theirs, Hicks, right? So acts of Islamophobia that really shake the Muslim community. These kids grew up here. They were fully involved in community service. Here's Suzanne, a physician here at UCSF, and your average, my perspective, your average Muslim American family, it hit the Muslim community so hard because that could have been me, right? There's no different. That's exactly how I felt. I wear hijab. I was next door to someone like that as well at one point, and that could have been me, right? Shot execution style over and over and over again in their own home. So when these kind of things happen, for the longest time, I feel that the Muslim community had been saying Islamophobia is real, but I wasn't really sure that others were really catching on to this as well. And there was definitely this sense of, is there some sort of oxymoron of being American and Muslim? Can the two ideals really work? And of course, those of us who were raised here are saying, we don't understand why that's even a discussion point. But then this happened. Or actually, before I say that, I want to say this idea of the triple minority status is really important. I'll come back to it later. This idea where you are a religious minority, but also a person of color, as many Muslims are, and in addition, many of whom are immigrants. Not all, but many of whom are immigrants. So you have kind of this triple whammy happening, right? And then this happens, right? So these are images actually right here from SFO. And I think, other than Trump holding up the travel ban, thankfully it was not at SFO. But here there's something that's really important that happens in 2017. There is definitely a sense of what Muslims, for the longest time, people were wondering, is this some sort of paranoia that all of you have on feeling like you're attacked or people are, are taking this conversation out of context. And I think that when the travel ban was signed and there he is holding it, it was sort of like there was two feelings that came out of that. One was, I told you so, right? There was a definite I knew this was real, right? When the president of this country is willing to do such a thing, right? And secondly, and more importantly, I think, what happened down here in the second set of pictures, because for all the years, and I don't know, I think we have different age groups in the room, But for those who were around for 9/11, now we're in a stage where we're either too young to even remember 9/11. A lot of our trainees were too young to even remember 9/11. But for those who were around and very much remember 9/11, it was, even then, there was not this kind of sentiment. For people to hold up signs that say, "We are Muslim too," or "No travel ban," or signs such as here, it was very much the silver lining in all of this. I think what this did for the country is it really unveiled either those who were really supportive or those who were really against Muslims in this country. And I think the true colors of people it really showed. And at that point it became even more realistic of what we were working with, the good and the bad, so to say, for this community. And as we move forward here, I think it's important before we really get into some of the clinical considerations is really talking about who are Muslims in the first place and who are they in America and how many are they and so on and so forth, their demographics. So we'll start by saying 1.8 Muslims in the world. And about a third of Muslims globally live in Western countries or countries in which they are minority groups, which is an important number and a large number. And in America specifically, you have somewhere between 6 to 10 million, and people think that's a really big range. Why is it like that? And it's because there's a lot of institutional mistrust. People are not willing to fill out surveys or register themselves as Muslims or say what they really are truly, because there has always been a bit of a paranoia of will there be a Muslim registry. And then this year, when such was announced that there was the possibility of it, it became very real, I think, for the community. So even more of a reason why people are not willing to admit exactly who they are and what their background is. Now for the Bay Area, and I'm going to share a little bit specifically about the Bay Area in a few minutes, but we have somewhere between 250,000 to 500,000 Muslims right here amongst us. And in terms of socioeconomic class, you see it's usually upper middle class, with the exception of the African American Muslim community, which I'll also speak to in a little bit. It's important to know that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the US and globally, and this is the kind of this infographic that's from the Pew study that shows kind of that growth. So even more important to have these kind of cultural sensitivity trainings, because the likelihood if you haven't already had Muslim clients and patients, you will, right? And so I think that's, I'm really thankful for this kind of discussion. Where and when did Muslims come? With Columbus, and there's even studies that show even before. People were here before Columbus? They were. They were. But our history books don't quite talk about that, do they? What's important here, this number of 15 to 30% come as African slaves, because then we can start discussing the history of African Americans in this country. And that's a very important, African American Muslims rather, in this country. And I think that's a very important discussion too. It's not a community that's often thought about when we talk about Muslims. And then you have a lot of immigrations, the late 1800s with Arabs, and the middle 1900s, the Iranians. And then from the 80s onwards, you have all types of different groups coming in. At first, you have people coming in mostly as blue-collar workers, and then in the kind of that 80s, 70s, and 80s kind of shift, now you're talking about what they call the brain drain, right, from different countries. So the really educated that are coming here with their education from their countries to really build and find opportunities here, which explains why the social economic group of current Muslim community in America is actually pretty, middle class and sometimes even upper middle class because of that history. So it's important to understand a little bit. So when I speak of Muslims, can I get a sense from you guys what ethnic groups we're talking about? What ethnic groups? I'm a teacher I do a lot of teaching, so I expect a conversation. What ethnic groups? Indonesians, nice, yes. Uh-huh. Yes. The Bay Area, yeah. Uh-huh. Social economic status, yes. Uh-huh. Other groups? Who are kind of primary groups of Muslims when we think about Muslims? There's no wrong answers. There truly are no wrong answers. The Middle East. Others? Indians? Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah. North Africans? I put this demographics, yeah, actually good. I put this demographics up because I think it's important to see these numbers. Because we often go straight to the Middle East. And at best, we might go to the subcontinent, right? However, we miss that there's just as many African American Muslims, right? And like I said, it's not a community that's often thought about, but it's absolutely integral to the fabric of the Muslim community, right? And so I think this is an important number here to show the different quarters. About a quarter African American, about a quarter South Asian, about a quarter Arab. And then the rest are from so many different countries, really all the countries across the globe. And what's important about Muslims really to understand, because there's always a sense of like, the interconnectedness of the Muslim community is a very important topic. It's true of most minority groups for sure, but I think what's interesting about this group is that there's so many different ethnic groups that are bound together by one faith. And they actually see themselves as one body. And to show this and illustrate a little more, here we have a discussion, here we have a map of the Ottoman Empire, right? So the very last Muslim empire before that fell, and all the different countries were split into different smaller countries. And so when you look at this, it's a swath, right, of land that was just one empire. Yet it went through so many different cultures and different continents and so many different types of people, but they all saw themselves as one empire. And I think that's a really important thing to understand about Muslims, the history of where they come from, so that we can all understand where we're going, right, going forward. But I'd like to illustrate this because I think it's really hard sometimes for people to understand why is it that people here are concerned about things in Indonesia and there's Muslims here worried about Rohingya or about Palestine or about North Africa or what's going on exactly. This helps explain a little more of the interconnectedness between the Muslim community nationally. And if we look locally, here we have what we call the Bay Area Muslim Study. This was published in 2013, not very long ago, but I think the infographics here are really, really wonderful. There's actually an entire report that you can look up, but I just included a couple slides of their most pertinent data, basically. And I think what's interesting here, when you look at ethnic breakdown in the Bay Area, you'll see that the folks from subcontinent are the majority, followed by Arabs. And then you have one group, one ethnic group that makes up a very large percentage. And those are those from Afghanistan. And it's important to know that Fremont, which isn't terribly far from here, is called Little Kabul, right? It has the largest number of Afghans outside of Afghanistan. So that makes that particular community very pertinent as we talk about Bay Area Muslims, even though it's just one country, right? And if you look at counties, I mean, here in San Francisco County, it's something like 3%, right? But Alameda and Santa Clara counties have the majority of Muslims in the Bay Area. And marital status is important because the institution of marriage is important as for those who are doing therapy, and especially when you get into, I think we have different professions in this room, marital therapy. The institution of marriage is important in the community. And religious identity is also interesting to see that most Muslims identify specifically as Sunni, and then you have different other groups breakdown. Here we talk a little bit about educational background, so you have a pretty educated community, right? Close to 75%. And in terms of wealth, medium income, you have the Bay Area in general is doing much better than the rest of the US. However, you have that the Muslim community in the Bay Area is doing fairly well too. And I think that's important to understand when we really speak about demographics. Everything from volunteering and really kind of civic engagement, you see that the numbers are pretty high. Also explaining why when we talk about Islamophobia and the clinical case that I gave at the very beginning, why it's very bothersome to American Muslims who are like, we're fully engaged in society here, what is going on, right? And so to this point, that if you live in a major city as we are, you probably already have colleagues or even friends who are Muslim or even family members perhaps. And then you know that certainly, and I say, as a physician, I always say, hospitals run on Muslim doctors, right? There's always the Dr. Khans and the Dr. Salmans and so on and so forth in most hospital systems. And so I think that also speaks a little bit to the brain drain that happened. But it's really important to realize Muslims are everywhere essentially and very much wish to be integrated within the community and have walked the walk and talked the talk, so to say. If we look at in beliefs just very quickly, we'll just touch on this. The Quran is the revealed scripture that Muslims believe in. That's kind of what they go back to. And how are so many different types of people connected is the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the sayings and teachings and implicit statements of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that Muslims emulate themselves after. And in terms of Sharia, this word that tends to confuse a lot of people and is definitely said in the media quite a bit, really all it means is Islamic law that governs civil practice. So when you have here, and Muslims will follow their Sharia law, which is, think of it as a ritual law, in addition to whatever state or national law is happening in whatever country they live in. So these are personal laws, right? Things that govern their own marriages, their own raising of their children, their own business transactions. Many Muslims have a problem with interest, for example, and will not engage, they'll only engage in interest-free banking or mortgages and such. Dietary law, inheritance, right? These are things that are kind of personal law. This is what's called Sharia. However, that term is often used, and it often sounds something like Sharia law, right? And it's problematic because then it sounds like something much scarier than what it actually is, right? Another really important point I want to share about Muslims, and I think you can't really do this topic justice unless you talk about the rich history that they come from, particularly as it relates to mental health. And here I think we're going to pause for just a minute because part of it is my own research and my own interest in this topic, but really because when we talk about mental health and the stigma within Muslim communities and minority communities, this actually piece of knowledge might be very useful for all of you as clinicians, right? So when you think about the Muslims, I should say, are very proud of their heritage. They're very proud particularly of the golden age of Islam, which a lot of developments have come out of that in medicine, in science, and in the humanities, but also in mental health. And I think that's a piece that's kind of missing from the current discussion on this topic. So let me ask all of you, where was the first psychiatric hospital and when? Where and when was the first psychiatric institution built? I imagine everyone here is in mental health. Where and when? Somebody guessed Syria. Okay. Any other guesses? And when? Any ideas? Roughly. Time period, time frame in the world. All right. Okay. So, what I'm glad for is that we're all going to learn quite a bit today. Turns out that the very first hospital, psychiatric ward within a hospital system happens in Baghdad in Iraq. And it is roughly in the 9th century. Then you have the first standalone psychiatric institutions that start popping up all throughout the Muslim world in this era and going forward. Now, I could probably do an entire lecture just on this topic, and I don't want to necessarily divert from our original topic for today, but I think it is important because you see the next 2 points on the slide. Because in the same period as the 9th century, what is happening across the way in Europe? What era was that called? The Dark Ages. And how were the mentally ill treated in the Dark Ages? So at best is this point here. At best, mental illnesses were considered spiritual illnesses, and so therefore they were sent to monasteries. And at worst, the mentally ill were burned as witches at the stake. Right? What's important to realize, remember, it's not the interconnected world that we have today. People are totally separated by space and time. But parallel to all of that happening in Europe, across the way in the Muslim empire, you have psychiatric institutions coming up with an understanding that there is more than just spiritual ailments. Very, very sophisticated discussions on genetics, yes, even genetics, on biology, on a medical, physiological understanding of what health issues and mental health as well. And I think this is a really important thing because, like I said, I could speak for this on a very long time, but it's interesting to see that even in that era, you have what we would today we'd call, we really pride ourselves on, the interdisciplinary team. Made up of whom? Who takes care of your patients? What's the team of people? Who are they? The nurse, the doctor, the chaplain, who else takes care? Interdisciplinary. Social worker, good. The who? The pharmacist, good. Yes. That is exactly the same interdisciplinary team that's taking place in these hospitals. 9th century, 10th century, 11th century. The reason I say this is because the things that we consider to be, we're so proud of our advancements today, some of this has already happened in history before. And some of it also is sort of misplaced and misaligned as to when and where they happened and with whom. Again, the topic today is different, but I think it's very important when you talk about it to a community that feels, the minority status, that feels Islamophobia, and also feels a lot of stigma from seeking out care that they really need. These points are actually very important. And I think it's really even more important to share with you, the last point is actually some of my own research. Because then I started to think, well, if that's really the case, I was reading about these Muslim hospitals and such in the Muslim lands, and how is it that they were so advanced? So then I started to say, wait a second, let's take a look at the medical manuscripts that actually were written at that time and focus specifically on the mental health portion of them. And luckily it was easy because I started from the head and went to the toe. So I could focus right here. But this is where my Islamic training, right, in Islamic sciences and in classical Arabic was really helpful. Because at that point I was able to actually read very, very old literature to figure out what was happening and what their understandings of mental health was. And what I found was really fascinating, and I'll only speak about one of the scientists that I was researching. His name is Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. And as I was going through his work, I was really amazed because he had chapter after chapter after chapter of what we would today would call the different mental illnesses. Depression, anxiety, what today we would call OCD, and so on. And it was just fascinating. But when I got to the OCD chapter specifically, I was really floored. And the reason was, I, like all of you, had learned that OCD was a very modern illness. It had only been recently incorporated and understood, right? And what I saw in his book was so fascinating that I really had a hard time really grappling with how is this that he could come up with something so astutely in the 9th century. So I went to Dr. Karan, who was our head of OCD department at Stanford, and said, I think I found this thing that talks about OCD. And he said, there's no way. I said, 9th century. And he said, no, there's no way. I've done all the research on the history of such and such. And he was very gracious, but he said, no, I'm a history buff. Like, I know this stuff. I was like, no, really, but it's still in Arabic. That's why you don't know. So he said, translate it, and so I did. And this is what we ended up with, right? DSM-5 and Balkhi, 9th century. What are you guys seeing? So the first to classify, diagnose, properly classify, diagnose, and treat, as far as we know, until more research comes out, obsessive compulsive disorder, the illness that we today call obsessive compulsive disorder, happens in the 9th century. When this was sent, this is published in the Journal of Affective Disorders. When this was sent to them, they were just like, immediately published. And as anybody who's published in medical journals, you know that never happens. And so they were just so amazed. And so we said, hey, this is cool, let's do this again. So we wrote about phobias next, Balkhi and his discussion on phobias. And that was to the Journal of Anxiety Disorders. And that took months and months and months to return. Because they said, we can't, your work is so unorthodox that we need to send it to historians of medicine to verify what on earth you're saying here. And this is what came back, right? And I only put this up here because I just want to illustrate, it's really important, as we know, that when you work in medicine, especially in academic medicine, that you always cite what comes before you. Well, you can't give credence to what's come before you if it's not even in the literature. Do you see what I'm saying? And I illustrate this even more because when we talk about Muslims and we talk about a community that feels very stigmatized and has quite a bit of stigma against mental health, these points have been excellent and have really helped me work with the community. Because even though dressed as I am, I'll say, get help. And they'll say, and I'll say, but did you know this is your own heritage? You know? And it's been really useful, right? And so I want to be able to illustrate that. And like I said, the Muslims and Mental Health Lab is doing, runs 8 or 9 different lines of research, one of which is just this historical line of research. And there's more in the pipeline coming through. I like this kind of work because I think it's important to really explain to the community itself, but also to those treating the Muslim community, what kind of resources and what kind of tips may be helpful, right? Let's go back to Islamophobia for a minute. All right, so this is where you guys get to engage a little bit more, right? It's early, so we need to engage here. Let's see. So I'm going to put up a couple of slides, and I'd like a couple of adjectives, right? Just throw out a few words, whatever comes to mind, and do not hesitate or rethink what you're saying, just put it out there, right? Just a couple of adjectives. Here we go. Descriptions? Adjectives? Female? Huh? Serious? Uh-huh. Pretty? Strong? All right. Anything else? Okay, next. This man. Getting ready for something, okay. Intense? Okay, don't rethink it. Just say it. Bearded, okay. 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 All right. Sorry? Adjusting his turban? Okay. Okay. All right. All right. How about these ladies? Hidden, covered, woman, presumably. Sorry? Mysterious. Okay. It's okay. All right. And these folks. Uh-huh. Sorry? Haggling? Telling a story. Good. Okay. Joking. Okay. All right. Anything else? So these were all images. I was kind of like collecting images. When you type in Muslims, what on earth would come up, right? So it's interesting. So let's go back to the first. So this is actually a newscaster from Chicago. It actually says, I think, Channel 4 there. And you know, it's not necessarily the very first image you may think of when you think of Muslim woman. But here is actually a very prominent one, at least in Chicago area, of a Muslim woman, right? That's very much in her local media channel, news channel. This young man is whoever said looking in a mirror is very astute, because that's precisely what he was doing. And it turns out that he was actually just attempting to, he was trying the turban on, trying to figure out how to do this thing, right? And it wasn't anything more sinister than that, although it may look like such, given all the images we constantly see of people who look kind of like this and then do something that's very atrocious. These ladies actually are nurses. They're actually standing next to an ambulance, and I believe this is in Turkey. And they are off to work. Educated women who are off to do their nursing work. And these men over here are actually not Muslim at all. They're Yemeni Jews. So they are Arab, yes, and so they dress Arab, but they are actually not Muslim at all. Yet the image was used to describe Muslims, right? So, I mean, there's, again, lots of different, the sound bites that are out there and the media pictures and images that are out there tend to be really confusing. And then I'm going to share with you a picture that came out just earlier in the week, right? Earlier, I guess, yeah, earlier in the week. Who's this? Yes, our Olympic bronze medalist, Ibtihaj Muhammad, who just represented the U.S. in this last Olympics and took home the bronze medal. She is African American, hijabi, Muslim, and Barbie just made their first hijabi Barbie doll, right? In the likes of her, with her saber and her fencing outfit and the like. And as soon as I saw this, I ran over to my 9-year-old daughter, who is into dolls still, and said, "Look!" Look. And her mouth just dropped. She was like, "Is that real?" I said, yes, how exciting, you know. And so we're celebrating this like wonderful thing that, you know, now she has a Barbie doll who's in her own likeness, which is a lot for young girls, especially when they see dolls that are not to their likeness and images that are not attainable either, right, has been very difficult. And so if you notice, I don't know if you can really tell, but her legs are actually quite muscular, very similar to Ibtihaj's own, right? So it's a very different kind of Barbie doll, if you will. But to me, even more than this, of course, I'm just scrolling and kind of showing my daughter all kinds of things. Remember, this is just like 2 days ago. And there's been tons of articles and Facebook posts and all the rest. So I think it was actually on Facebook. And I was kind of like scrolling through. And in the comments, you have everything from like, yay, and I have to say the good comments actually outweigh the bad. But then there's all types of stuff, all types of anger and even disgust at how Mattel, the company that owns Barbie, can do this. Right? And is this appropriate? And what does this mean? Isn't this oppressive? And so on and so forth. And then I come across this and have to scroll through really fast so my daughter doesn't see it. Right? It's like, is this what we should do when we bring Ibtihaj's doll home? An American medalist, right, who brings home American medal from the Olympics. And in her honor, they make a doll, and this is what is showing, right? Like literally right under the picture. So I'm like trying to scroll really fast so my daughter doesn't see it, right? But this is the kind of thing that happens. It's like you can barely celebrate without this, right? It just keeps on happening. And I think that's kind of where the discussion today is, where we talk about what is this current crisis, and as clinicians, what are we actually treating and trying to treat here when we talk about folks from the Muslim community. So you really have, you know, this increased media attention, some of which is positive, a lot of which is not, and you really have other issues already at hand, like the PTSD that we spoke about earlier, because folks from Muslim countries often are coming from war-torn countries to begin with, right, and hoping to kind of form a new life here. And then you talk about regular issues that any groups that immigrate here deal with, acculturation, right, generation gaps, cultural shock, and so on and so forth. And we look at the need for services. CARE, which is the Council on American Islamic Relations, has really put out, and they take all the different, you know, this is the place where Muslims will call when they feel discriminated against, and these are lawyers and attorneys who will advocate on their behalf. And so you have here everything from, you know, denial of religious accommodations to job termination to the verbal abuse, unequal treatment, denial of employment, and some of which I personally have felt too. You know, Muslims pray 5 times a day. 5 times a day. That's all throughout your day, which means that at any given day, I might take a corner if I can't find a chapel nearby or a place that's quiet enough, and certainly during my residency and fellowship, particularly intern year, running around the hospital, trying to get to the resident room, but it was just, sometimes you just couldn't because the pager would go off and you just couldn't, right? And so like, you know, I'd run and duck into like some empty room as much as I could to catch my 5 daily prayers, but it's sort of the plight. Where in the Muslim world, of course, prayer spaces are built into every facility because it's part of your daily life, right, prayer. And so here it's kind of like you're doing this, and the number of times that I've prayed in just a quiet corner like that there, and I've had someone, you know, like the one time I was in 6th grade in Chuck E. Cheese and thought it was an empty door, but it turned out it was like where you then take the trash out. And the lady was trying to talk to me, and when you're in prayer, you can't speak back. You're just focusing on prayer. And decided to throw the trash bags over my head, right? You know, these are like daily, no, maybe not daily, but often enough occurrences in Muslim life that it's kind of like, it's really difficult sometimes. So when we talk about, you know, trauma that tends to happen over and over again, and then you wonder why people have a really hard time admitting that they're a Muslim or wanting to really say that to you directly because they're not really sure of what kind of judgment will come after. But that also leads to a lot of barriers of service. So the literature shows clearly that Muslims are really hesitant to get care because of that fear of judgment. And really this hesitancy also that maybe the professionals I go to won't really understand Islamic values, right? And so then we end up with this health gap. And certainly a mistrust of providers or fear of the treatment itself, fear of racism, discrimination, and some of which is also could be language barriers and differences in communication. I've had countless. In fact, the very first student that I had written that clinical case about in the Green Journal, she actually said to me, it's not like I haven't tried, after all that trauma that happened to me, it's not like I didn't try to get care. It's that every time I tried, I either got too much pity, and that was not useful, or the gap was so wide between me and the therapist, I was exhausted just trying to catch the therapist up, that I gave up. I knew I should have continued, I knew I needed the help, but it was just exhausting trying to catch the therapist up, which is even more of a reason why we talk about cultural sensitivity trainings, right? And implicit bias trainings, which I'll speak to a little more in the end. And knowing also that the imams or spiritual leadership for many, remember we showed the earlier numbers of, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people within the Muslim community are very connected spiritually. And so spiritual leadership is very important. And so the imams become kind of your first line responders, yet they're not trained in mental health. So unless there's a communication between mental health providers and community psychiatry, right, how is it that you're going to get anything, right? The imams may inadvertently say something they shouldn't, and the community psychiatrists aren't really, or psychiatrists in general, aren't really connected to that kind of leadership either. But it's important to know that's really where they're going to go. And the topic of integrating spirituality into the treatment turns out to be really important to the Muslim community. But as we know in our training is quite secular. So what do you do with a community that feels very spiritually inclined, right? So you end up having lots of other explanations for mental illness, right? Everything from the evil eye, which exists in other cultures and religions and backgrounds as well, to possession, right? To the idea that there maybe is, that this is kind of a spiritual ailment or a spiritual deficit, and that's why a person is feeling depressed or anxious, let's say. So you get all those different types of explanations and have to sort of deal with them as you're working with the Muslim population. And this is some really interesting research too, the issue of anxiety and depression within American Muslims and PTSD, all of which are quite high compared to other populations. This slide in particular I think is important to kind of pause and spend a little time with because of the cultural sensitivity. When we talk about cultural sensitivity training, what are we talking about exactly? And here I would say this idea, the very first one, collectivist cultures. This is important because many Muslim communities come from what we call collectivist versus individualistic cultures. Meaning that when you say, and as often we are trained in our training to say things like, do what makes you feel better. Whatever floats your boat. We have these kind of euphemisms that we say. However, for folks from collectivist cultures, that's like in one ear out the other. Because it's me and my parents and my siblings and my family and my children. Not to say other communities aren't like this too, but there's a very much of a collectivist culture where it's like you can't really pop up as an individual and do your thing without accounting for everybody else, which causes some tension. And there is that original fear that I mentioned, the hesitancy of getting care, because people would say, well, how do I know that I'm not going to go and say, hey, I'm having some marriage difficulties, and then be told, oh, some sort of negative statement of, oh, is that how Muslim marriages run, or maybe you should just leave, or however. Although that's not our training, we're much more, I hope, attuned to cultural differences like that. But there is that fear, whether real or perceived, right? Other parts of this, like, this idea of altruism is really important. Doing things for the sake of God is very important. Eye contact also becomes an important thing. So between gender, there is definitely a limited interaction when the person isn't a family member or close relative of yours. And so a patient may come in and actually not look at the doctor, and that is, in their point of view, respect. But in the doctor's point of view, what would we say on our mental status exam? Right? So you see, yet there's nothing pathologically problematic with that patient, right? And I think that's important. Same with physical contact. The very first thing we do is do what when we meet a patient, specifically as physicians or therapists and such? What do we do? Right? However, in not all Muslims, remember, it's a whole spectrum of people. So some folks shake hands without any issue at all. But there are many others who are really kind of like, will hesitate, because if it's a woman and shaking hands with a man, or a man shaking hands with a woman, it's like, wait, this is not something that's part of our culture. And so it's problematic. But then that's the very first encounter. So how do you ever come back with that how do you build rapport again after something like that is broken? And so I often will recommend to people, like, just sort of wait and see what the patient does, right? If they kind of jut out their hand, great. And if not, then you kind of understood this is part of they're adhering to the Muslim culture that they had grown up with. There's more here in terms of like Friday prayers and such, which I think are important too, because remember, it's a congregational prayer that happens in the middle of a work day here in the States, right? But in the Muslim land, Friday is the weekend. So they're able to do their congregational, kind of like a Sunday morning prayer and service, right? It's on a weekend. So if you wish to go, you're able to go because it's a weekend. But here it's in the middle of a work day. So what happens to the Muslims who need to do their obligatory congregational Friday prayers, that they have to then negotiate with their supervisors and such to take that time off? And if they're hesitant about admitting that they're Muslim and feeling kind of the stigma behind it, it becomes really difficult to have that conversation. Yet it's something obligatory and they feel very guilty for having left, right? So this idea of religious sensitivities is certainly not something that is discussed only first or with the Muslims only. Certainly a lot of my own mentors who are listed here, Koning and Larson and Pargament and the rest that have really talked about these topics, and Dr. Liu, of course, really spoke about the importance of faith-based communities who really God is at the central of their world frame, and how when we work with such patients or clients, to not leave that out. Because if we do, the world view that kind of centers God in the middle there, it's kind of like fragmented. And as you know, in therapy, you're supposed to work with the whole person. So taking God out of the picture for a God-centered person becomes really difficult. Yet again, it's not part of our training, right? We tend to really kind of split the two things. I like this little comic here, kind of split the two things. And it becomes even uncomfortable. There's a course that I teach at Stanford called Culture and Religion in Psychiatry, and we teach it to our PGY3s. It's a 12-week course. And in that course, we start actually with the cultural formulation at the very beginning. But I have the residents do the cultural formulation on themselves. Right? I say to them, if you're going to do this onto patients, then you have to feel the discomfort sometimes that it takes yourself. So we put up these big white sheets, all of the 4 parts of it, and have them go around and actually feel. And you should see their hesitation, like, am I? They don't want to, right? But it's really important because this is essentially this topic of what is the culture of mental health today, right? And it's very uncomfortable, and it's actually interesting to see what people write. And inevitably, I'll have at least one resident, if not 2, every class, and I've taught this now, co-taught it for maybe, I think we've had 6 cohorts now, and inevitably, I'll have at least one resident who will raise their hand and say, why are we studying this? Didn't we do this in med school? And I'll say, yes, however, there's much more to learn here. But I don't have a culture. Inevitably. And so I'll say, if I picked you up and put you down in the middle of Ghana, now do you have a culture, right? And so that really starts to kind of shift something in their thinking. Like, oh yeah, I guess I do have a culture. And I guess medicine itself has a culture, and the field of psychiatry itself has a culture, right? And I think that's what's really important for our trainees to understand, that there is, we come from a worldview in the therapeutic space, right, in that room, where we bring our own biases into that room, and sometimes we don't even realize it. And that's what patients and clients pick up on, and I think that's really important to consider. So actually, just recently, I was asked to help with these unconscious trainings for our medical students and residents at Stanford. And Module 6 is actually really interesting. It's specifically on a spiritual case. And Mr. Ali here, who is coming for a regular checkup and has a wife who just recently passed away, but is hearing God's voice, right? So in the scenario, the resident immediately goes to the attending and says, I think this person has auditory hallucinations, right? And then a discussion ensues over what is schizophrenia actually, what is the possibility of complicated grief reaction, and what is the possibility that it's neither, it's nothing even pathological, But if we did our actual asking the questions, we'd find that Mr. Ali, who she assumed actually was Muslim, turns out in this scenario not even to be Muslim. It turns out that he, that in his church they speak in tongues, and that they're able to actually feel that they're able to communicate the word of God, and so on and so forth. So it's a whole different paradigm. But the resident actually says in the case scenario, I never asked questions on religion because we were taught not to. And then it goes through that actually isn't so useful because you missed a very important piece of this man's history, and you also potentially could misdiagnose him, right? So this is kind of what I mean by unconscious bias trainings. And I think this is incredibly important because, I hope there's also the implicit bias trainings that Harvard does, and I really recommend either, so that our trainees and ourselves really see what we're bringing into the room without even realizing it sometimes. Recently, with all the travel ban and the rest, in the Muslim community, on campus, there was, the Markaz is the Muslim Cultural Center on campus, and recently they kind of partnered with CAPS and decided to have me come out and actually do these healing circles and anonymous drop-in sessions. And this was a really important point for the Muslim students on campus because A, we found that they weren't willing to go into CAPS. They were really worried about the EMR, right, documentation, and anything that had their name on it and said Muslim too. Because what about then the possible Muslim registry? So unless it was absolutely anonymous, we found that the students actually weren't willing to come in for care. So my recommendation really, in addition to the unconscious bias trainings and implicit trainings, is to really also see what can you do for anonymous care and help. And this really helped our students. I would really recommend something similar on all the different campuses. So we have these healing circles and women's reflection groups and also anonymous drop-in sessions that have been very effective. Now, in closing, I want to talk a little bit more about the general community as well. And here is some work that we had done recently to figure out what were the sentiments of Muslims within the Bay Area in relation to mental health. What was missing? What did they need more of? Why weren't they willing to actually come and seek care? And this work has been really phenomenal. CBPR, community-based participatory research, meant that we actually went to the community to be able to figure out what their needs were. So now we actually have a Bay Area Muslim mental health a CAB, a community advisory board that meets monthly and talks about what are the needs of mental health in the Bay Area. And also we have these monthly meetings from Muslim mental health professionals to then be able to deliver that care. Then after the elections, we also formed a crisis response team as well. And I think all three have been important. But the thing that kept coming up after we did all of our analysis of the data and the focus groups, we did a focus group for men, for women, for youth, and for imams. And it was really interesting to see the work that was, the comments that were coming out of there, and also the needs. And almost unanimously, the most thing that came out of this is, right, qualitative data, right? So the most thing that came out over and over and over again was the need to integrate spirituality into therapy and into mental health care. Now that's a very big ticket item to ask for folks that have been trained in the systems that we have been trained in. So what do you do again with this community that won't really come out for care as much unless they felt that there was that integration of both worlds? So that led to a little bit more. This is some of our team, and we won the Stanford Community Advisory, the Community Award, Mental Health Award this past year. But that kind of, something important came out of it, and I hope will be a resource for all of you, which is the Khalil Center. And the Khalil Center, actually, its branches are originally from Chicago, and they've been around for about 7 or 8 years. But the branch in the Bay Area only took place in the last 2 years. We started in the last 2 years because of the research that came out that showed that it really needs to have a place where you can refer Muslims to that does actually integrate both worlds together for more longer-term care. And so what it is, and I hope you'll find that this is kind of interesting work, but also a place for all of you to have as a resource and a reference, a referral site, is a community wellness center that is absolutely professionally trained psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers and the like, along with integrating Islamic spiritual techniques into that actual therapy. And it's threefold. It has the actual direct services, therapy services, but it also has psychoeducation. So quite a bit of work that goes into the community, the various Muslim community centers all throughout the Bay Area, doing workshops and classes on the topic of mental health, busting stigma, essentially, right? And that there's a third arm of research, because you can't do this kind of work and actually integrate Islamic psychotherapeutic techniques unless you've done the research to prove what those are and actually integrate them, hopefully flawlessly into the actual therapy process. And these kind of three different parts here have been really phenomenal. And even in the just couple of years that we've been around, we opened up the first office in Santa Clara. And within a year, we found that we had offered 1,000 sessions. And that was kind of like key to us, like, whoa, there was a gap here, a void that was unfilled for a really long time. And then so many people made use of it. So within that, by the next year, we opened a site in Pleasanton. And just last weekend, 2 weekends ago, we opened up our newest branch in Union City. So within 3 years, we've now had 3 centers throughout the Bay Area. And if you're wondering why they're important, it's because of questions like this. We give these questions on intake just to see what the needs are. And this whole idea of, would somebody consider going to a non-Muslim therapist before coming to Khalil Center? The majority said no. And did they actually visit anybody? The vast majority said no. And then you ask about religious values, that they share your same religious values. You find that between extremely important and somewhat important is, again, the majority. But this last question is the one that really gets me. The one that says integrating spirituality into, it's not enough to have somebody who shares the same religion. And of course, there's a very hot debate in the literature about whether matching really works, right? Matching a client to a therapist that have the same background. But this is really interesting. Within this community, you're finding that the integration of spirituality into the therapy process becomes really important. Kind of the framework, right? The worldview, the idea of like fate and how things play, right, is really important to people. And so you're getting 98% saying that this is either somewhat important or extremely important to them. So again, really speaking to the need of this community. Does it work? Well, we're seeing some progress here in people's P-scores. And we're also, the research is sort of ongoing. And I'm really excited actually to announce that starting January 1st, we will have the first evidence-based kind of clinical trial on integrating Islamic psychotherapeutic techniques into therapy. And it's going to roll over the next 2 years, and to see whether we really have we have a lot of anecdotal evidence, but see the actual hard evidence behind this. Really excited about that new study. And again, in just this idea of prevention and community intervention, you can't, I feel, do this work siloed. It has to sort of be out into the community, engage with the various community partners to really have buy-in into mental health services and needs. The last point that I'll make actually is on payment, because there's always a lot of questions. And I think that this is a great thing because it really helps the majority of folks in the community. So it takes private insurances, PPO insurances. Khalil Center also does a sliding scale for those who are maybe on Kaiser or some insurance that is not actually contracted. And it's a pretty generous sliding scale. And then there is the last part, which is charitable funds. Zakat. Zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It is the 2.5% saved, it's the alms charity that is given on saved wealth that a Muslim pays 2.5% of their saved wealth per year if they're capable of doing so. And historically, this is actually a really interesting point for everybody who's a mental health clinician in the room. Historically, so these are earmarked funds. They can only go to specific purposes. And historically, it turns out that mental health services were one of those earmarked funds. So in Muslim societies and communities, when we talked about those very first Muslim hospitals, psychiatric wards and psychiatric hospitals, they were completely and fully funded by zakat wealth, which meant that anybody within the Muslim lands that had a mental health issue can go to these institutions and be treated free of charge. So don't be scared of Sharia law. In fact, they might even want to embrace that, that concept. But I mean to say, it's really enlightening to see that mental health was so integral and part of the original understanding of a Muslim community. And the Khalil Center is trying to do the same here. So it offers zakat funds for anybody who's not able to, who doesn't have insurance or doesn't meet the sliding scale, and then it offers basically free of charge to come in and get care. So we hope that this kind of model brings in everybody and really takes down the stigma, right, the barriers to seeking care within the Muslim community. And this is how you're able to get hold of them. There's a website you're welcome to visit. And it is, through my work at Stanford, it is a community partner with Stanford. But we've also done some really wonderful work. For example, we've contracted with UC Berkeley. So our Khalil Center therapists are on site at Berkeley offering care to the Muslim students on campus. We've done this at a few other places, and also through CAPS, and also a few other local Islamic schools. And we've just partnered with so many other institutions and nonprofits within the Bay Area that work predominantly with Muslim communities. So that's been really useful as well. And the most newest thing that we've just rolled out is the crisis hotline. So this is a national hotline for Muslim youth and Muslims in general to call, or a chat, to go into the website and chat if they feel like they're not ready to come and get help yet, but they want to start maybe at the chat line. And so that just actually rolled out last month, so we're really excited, and we are seeing an uptake in people using that as well. So this is really, I hope that you'll find this as a resource and useful to you. And we certainly welcome, between the Khalil Center and between the Stanford Muslims and Mental Health Lab, absolutely welcome your interest and also any collaboration you wish to let us know about in working with Muslims. And lastly here, I'll just leave you my contact information and tell you that it was a pleasure speaking to all of you this morning. And at this point, I welcome your questions.
So Christina had to step out.
Yeah, hi.
That was a wonderful talk. So if you ask a question, if you wouldn't mind just repeating the question back so we can record it, that would be fantastic.
Sure thing.
Great.
You mentioned the dietary law. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The question was on dietary law? Yes. Yeah, so Muslims who are observing the Muslim tradition for dietary law is called halal. And halal means that it's the ritual slaughter of meat that is done in a very humanistic way, in which there's some very clear criteria of how it's done, in which the animal doesn't suffer, and that is also the blood is let out in a specific way, and then the name of God is also pronounced on that meat, so it's blessed, and then the Muslims are able to consume that meat. Otherwise, they're actually not able to consume meat unless it's slaughtered in that ritual way. It's very similar to kosher rulings, although they are different rulings specific, but it's the same idea of like dietary laws that concern meat. For example, in the Muslim arena, it concerns meat and also the prohibition of alcohol consumption or alcohol within any food as well, or any pork products or derivative of pork products.
First of all, thank you for such a wonderful talk on such an important topic. Really appreciate it. My question is about Islamically integrated psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. Is that okay? And you had mentioned that there are specific techniques, and I was wondering if you could speak more about that, especially for a non-Muslim therapist who may be working with Muslim patients, and how our work in the room might look different, or if there are particular techniques to privilege over others.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So the question was on kind of Islamically integrated psychotherapy techniques within the therapeutic process and what that means exactly. And a lot of it goes back to the framework of understanding the human psyche. So in the Khalil Center, we use the Ghazalian model. Imam Ghazali was a very famous thinker and leader of Islamic thought in the middle of the Islamic Golden Era period. And if you can think of, and I actually wish I had the diagram here, but if you can think of the understanding of the human psyche is somewhat different than there's similarities but also differences than the typical, if you will, Freudian or Jungian understanding of the human psyche. So here you would think of, the heart kind of being in the center. This is how Imam Ghazali conceptualized it, where the heart is sort of in the center, and then you have the mind on top, the aql, what he calls the mind, and then you have the ruh, which is the spirit, right? And the spirit or soul. And then you have the aql, ruh, and the, now I'm going to blank out. Let's see here. So basically it's the spirit and soul the spirit, and then you have the soul. So they kind of distinguish the two things from each other. And here, this understanding or this framework then kind of shifts things a little bit, where if you know that the heart is in the middle, there's really this broader conceptualization of what that means in therapy. Because you don't directly go to the mind. It actually is the heart is the one in control, and it directs what's happening with the mind. So it's a little bit of a shift from kind of a very kind of purely neurobiological focus, if you will, to really bringing the heart into the discussion. And in terms of techniques, like when you talk about techniques, I mentioned fate, for example, where fate is a really important concept in Islam of the many different concepts that are believed in. But then we talk about taking the better side of that. So you can look at, it's the kind of the glass half empty or half full understanding, where you can look at it as this such and such happened to you. Now, do I look at it with a pessimistic point of view or an optimistic point of view? So a lot of similarities to what we're already trained in, but in really kind of focusing it in, and I've had Muslims say this, like even just using the word fate within therapy is very useful to them, because it's like, wait, that's something I understand. That's a concept I believe in. Okay, what about fate? And then you kind of go through this whole, kind of opens up a discussion on, well, couldn't it be like this or like this, right? And then that really helps really shifting, right, reframing thinking. Topics and concepts that we may already be trained in, but using the correct terminology as well is important. So that's an example of concepts that are, maybe we're shifting or using the right terminology. But then there's also other techniques that are actually new to or different than what we typically would use. So the one I mentioned about kind of very simply in a nutshell, integrating for a God-centered community, right? Integrating the discussion of God, like where is the space, where is God in this discussion? Because if a person's coping mechanism has been to talk to God, and in therapy, it's like the therapist is seeing it as a one-on-one conversation, but the patient is seeing it as there's actually three entities in the room: them, the therapist, and God. Right? So there is another entity here in the room, so to say, and that's missed altogether. Right, in therapy. So for a God-centered person, that's really important. So when the therapist doesn't actually acknowledge that that's happening for the patient, there is a point there that can really be, there's a rapport that's hard to rebuild. Do you see what I'm saying? After that's missed. And so it works for the Muslim community, but certainly works also for other God-centered communities as well. Yeah, happy to have a much larger discussion on that, but that's in a nutshell. Yeah.
Hi, thank you again for the talk. With regards to the work that you've done over the last couple of years at the Khalil Center, have you seen parallel as far as with some of the challenges that the Muslim population has with the general public as far as portion of mood disorders or portion of anxiety disorders or even substance use disorders? Or have you seen a greater portion of maybe trauma disorders and things of that sort?
So the question is, what kind of disorders do I see most often with the Muslim community? It's interesting. I guess I can answer that twofold, my own personal clinical work, but also what we're now seeing at the Khalil Center as well. So in my own personal clinical work, I would say it's everything, right? Everything that's a human condition goes for Muslims as it does for everybody else. Probably an overrepresentation of PTSD more than other, potentially more than other groups, just because, again, the history that we talked about with immigration status and certainly with recent social political climate and the rest. However, I think we mentioned there were some points in there about depression and anxiety being quite high as well. Now, in the Khalil Center, interestingly enough, so we're seeing all of those things, but we're also seeing quite a bit of marital therapy issues as well. And I think that has a lot to do. There was a couple of points in there about kind of, people who may have been married. When you talk about different cultures intermarrying, or cultures, somebody's from back home, from wherever back home might be, and someone's from here, or maybe they've both come here, but now they're kind of acculturating, and so there's a divide between their understandings of what marriage was compared to what it was in the cultures in which they grew up in, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting point that we're just seeing a lot of marriage therapy, and it could also be because that might be the easiest to come forward for, right? That then opens up, actually there's depression, actually there's a number of like OCD cases, for example, that we discovered through what originally came in as marriage therapy. That may just be the first door people are willing to enter, so to say. Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. It was
Sure.
incredibly informative. My question is regarding, can you offer us some insight on Islamic perspective on suicide, and with that in regards to that, and any thoughts about death and afterlife in general?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. Definitely. So the question is on Islam's understanding or what it says on suicide. Like most world religions, it says that suicide is prohibited. The person is not to take their own life. What that means for a suicidal person, of course, is difficult. Because for anybody who's worked with folks who are, especially those who are chronically suicidal, right, it is a difficult process. And in that process, there's a lot of, I have a patient currently right now who's chronic and has been chronically suicidal. And there's a lot of talk of, so where is God in the picture, right? If God is a merciful God, why do I feel this way? There's just a lot of this kind of back and forth, as would be with most folks who have, again, a God-centered worldview, but they're feeling like they don't want to be here anymore. So that's kind of the textual rule on suicide. And then there's the human aspect of how do you deal with this topic exactly, right? So I don't know if that helps answer a little bit, but that's in a nutshell.
I think we have time for one more question.
Sure.
Thank you for the insightful talk. And there was the slide mentioning the Islamic Americans were unhappy than American people.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there will be a little bit different between Islamic born in U.S. and immigrant from their original country. Can you tell us more about the difference between two populations? Islamic born in U.S. and immigrant from their original countries.
So is your question about what is the difference between them in relation to a specific disorder, or?
The general differences and their unhappiness, their feeling unhappiness staying in the U.S.
Yeah. I don't know that I can answer very well or do justice to the second part of it, just because I don't have my own study that specifically shows immigrant-born versus U.S.-born versus in unhappiness in general. But what I can tell you in terms of just differences, right, which I think you're going to find in all different immigrant groups, is that there is absolutely acculturation issues and also generational gaps that end up happening, where you have folks who are parents who are feeling like they want to make sure that the culture that they came from and the roots which they came from aren't lost, yet some of that isn't exactly transferring over as well to a more Americanized, if you will, youngster who feels like, but this is what all my other friends are doing, why do I have to do it this way? These are traditional values that maybe don't apply. And the happiest medium, of course, is when the person is able to kind of synchronize both things. Like, this is my culture, my heritage, my background, and this is myself, this is who I am as an American, and I'm able to do both, right? So in a healthy situation, people are able to say, Arab American, Muslim, Indian American, Muslim, they're able to kind of do these multiple, and that it's okay to have multiple understandings of who you are, right? Multiple layers of who you are. But I think that's where sometimes we run into, like when we do therapy with parents and youngsters, especially adolescents, we have a lot of trouble where but it has to be like this, or this is the one way here. And there's a lot of just informing and educating and kind of working through whatever hesitations they have, which are almost always they're worried they're going to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? So that's what I can speak to, and I think there's definitely that tension. Again, it exists in all groups that have immigrant background, but we certainly see this in the Muslim population as well. Yeah.
All right, one more question. Would you like the mic?
And I was just wondering, in order to be inclusive and to include prayer space, what do we need to make sure is a part of
What an awesome question. That's really great. I'm so glad to hear that you're asking that. And I think it's been wonderful to see that with inclusivity kind of measures that folks are taking to really think about the different needs. Really, when I was in training, I think we did actually have a chapel within the hospital system, as you know, is just so huge. And especially when you're a busy resident running around like a chicken with your head cut off. It's just really hard to get to where you need to be, specifically because prayer happens, there's the pre-dawn prayer and the one before sleep, which are fine, but then there's the ones that are in the middle of the day, and they change with the time. So when it's summer, the day's really nice and long, but in the winter, it's really, really short. So there's like a noontime prayer, and then within a couple of hours after that, there's what would be the third prayer of the day. Then there's the sunset prayer. So of course, in the winter, that shifts up, and in the summer, it shifts down. But it means that a resident or a physician that's an attending or however that's in the hospital system is needing to do at least 2 or 3, if they're observant Muslim and wish to pray, they're going to do 2 or 3 at least of their prayers right there, or if they're on call, they're going to do them all, right? So it'd be really nice to have kind of just, even if it's literally an empty space, because Muslims don't need anything in the room. They might use a prayer rug to pray on just for cleanliness sake, but they don't necessarily need anything actually. They just pray towards the direction of the Qibla and the Kaaba that's in Mecca. They're praying in that direction and in an empty space. So as much as an empty room can be made available, that's not very large necessarily, it would be so useful within every building that's around. I think that would really alleviate a lot of tension. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so very much for your attendance this morning. I hope this was useful. I'll stick around for other questions. I have cards here, and information about the Khalil Center is here if you should need it. Thank you again so much.